So the actual tab panel is a little more complex than the login form. The login form is just a simple form with a username, a password, and a submit button. But the tab panel, as you guessed it, will actually have tabs in it. And so we could have created yet another JavaScript file, and we could have extracted the tab panel as a separate file. But sometimes it's not very big and you want to keep it simple and clean. So I think a good choice here is not to actually create this area right here as a separate JavaScript file, but I think this is reasonable to have in one file. So what's happening here is the second item in this top panel is a tab. Remember, the first one is the login. We've put the tab bar at the bottom. If you remember, it showed sessions and presenters at the bottom, and of course dock to the bottom, because remember, components can dock. And this tab panel is actually a component. It's lower level. And then the tab panel has two items, session nav view, title sessions, and we're using the info icon for both. We talked about this earlier, but essentially we have a certain number of icons available to us, and info happens to be one of them. We could load more complex icons and have things like a clock or something for sessions, and for presenters we could have an icon of people. But for now we're making them both info. So the two tabs are session nav view and presenter nav view. And then when we go and look at those two classes, session nav view here, we won't click on it, presenters nav view here, those are actually going to encapsulate the presenters list and the sessions list, which are in this file, So that's basically it. We've now completely talked about how this particular page works. And if we look at the login form panel, that's of course very simple. It extends ext.form panel, which we've talked about before. It has the items text field, password field, and a login button. So even though I promised earlier that I would make this a 100% production app, I guess I shouldn't have used the word 100%, because there are some shortcuts I have taken, though I'm showing you a complete example of the correct way to do it later. What I'm talking specifically about is the way the login button works. Is we created a listener on the login form panel. Here's the listener. We've talked about that previously. It has a function called onMyButtonTap. It's listening for the event tap. And this delegate is actually new. We haven't seen delegate. But what delegate does is it looks for the pound login button, tells it to look for basically the method that's part of this class. So if I were to look at how this class is defined, we have a method defined on the bottom, on my button tap, which is what this delegate is referencing. And through the magic of Sencha Touch, it does this internally. When you tap on the event, when you tap on the login button, it's going to execute this function on my button tap. And so notice we say button.up.up.animate active item. We tell it to animate active item is essentially the same as set active item, but it does it as an animation. We're telling it to set it to item 1. If you remember, back in our original top panel, we had two items in the collection. We had login form panel and we had tab panel. Tab panel is number 1. Login form panel is number 0. So going back to login form panel, because we're actually on the login form and the button is on the toolbar of the login form, button.up.up essentially takes us to the lower panel, the top panel, and then it executes animate active item and tells it to flip to the other page. The reason this is not very good for production is these .up.ups are very clever, but one thing you'll find when you're building real apps is that you may decide, well, I built this with a layout card manager and I put it below a navigator, and I really should have put it below a panel, and I should have stuck a component after that. Well, then all these button.up.up kinds of things break. So in reality, what we want to do is we want to navigate to components. So we somehow want to label this component. And remember I mentioned earlier that one of the interesting parts of this component, of these panels, they all have aliases. When we look at the ext.component query later, you'll see how we can get a reference to this component using ext.component query rather than doing the error-prone, easy-to-break things like button.up.up syntax.